As a preface, I have to say that the past 6 years, and especially the last 2, have scorched the earth of the scholarly vocabulary that I had established for myself in the preceding, almost 40. I'm reminded of the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, who, after experiencing the devastation of the Spanish Civil War, wrote that his readers would no longer recognize him, that they would ask where his familiar poetic lyricism had gone. In its place, he wrote simply, "Venid a ver la sangre por las calles," come and see the blood in the streets. But Neruda has become doubly unrecognizable. The title of his posthumous 1974 memoir, Confieso que he vivido, I confess that I have lived, all but forgotten, was provocatively rewritten in 2015 by Chilean artist Carla Moreno as Confieso que he violado. I confess that I have raped, to foreground Neruda's own account of how he forced himself upon his Tamil maid when living in Sri Lanka as Chilean consul in the 1920s. We stand, or at least I feel I do, at a cultural crossroads as I have never seen or thought I would see in my lifetime. It feels like the forces of the world are gathering around 2 poles, one affirming difference and diversity, the other affirming the status quo of whiteness and masculinity and their twin vice grip on capital and resources. This battle to control memory, education, the terms of immigration and incarceration, voting maps and political power, sexuality and marriage, and bodies from conception to death, is squarely informed by the story of racialized and gendered capital and resources, though I would say we hardly know how to talk about both race and gender at the same time, counting myself humbly, honestly, plainly among those who struggle to do so. Feminist Bolivian activist Maria Galindo of the group Mujeres Creando, Women Creating, warns tersely, "No se puede descolonizar sin despatriarcalizar." We cannot decolonize unless we also depatriarchalize. Not a word we say much in English. It feels as though the peeling away of the onion of injustice only reveals that injustice to be so widespread, so ineluctably imminent to our world, that when we go to eradicate it, none of it remains, none of the onion, that is, leaving us empty-handed and speechless as we try to identify, diagnose, denounce the same patterns that continue to repeat. In a lecture on the Obama administration's soft coup in Central America, for example, Noam Chomsky called Honduras Haiti. When an audience member spoke up to correct his mistake, Chomsky's composure was entirely unaffected. Instead, he turned his slip of the tongue into a source of wisdom without skipping a beat, calmly reflecting that it didn't really matter which country we were talking about, that their patterns of economic exploitation fit together in a unified portrait of racialized and gendered injustice in the hemisphere, or the world for that matter, since their gaze is at the level of world systems. Unequal affect. What is helpful for me, as someone who has spent a great deal of time thinking about the relationship between capitalism and affect, is Quijano's identification of universality as a construct that was designed to allow a very specifically white, male, and European/Eurocentric elite to dismantle monarchy and to erect democracy. In this view, the concept of the universal, and I would say by extension, perhaps even of the human, only ever applied to this small group as a rhetoric for leveling out their own internal differences of class rank and privilege. But it was used to justify their own brand of government by the people, for the people, and so it has become the capacious signifier that many have since sought to stretch to encompass all the groups that it was never intended to embrace. Hannah Jones, for example, notes that the U.S. Declaration of Independence was never meant to be for everyone, but rather only for a few, a white male landowning few. but that its self-authorizing language of inclusivity has had the effect of opening the door for the perfection of the ideals that it espoused by those, ironically, that it sought to exclude. Thus, she concludes that African Americans have been the most dedicated, if not also the most systematically frustrated, perfecters of the U.S. Union. I can't help here but wonder if we think of humanity as a presupposed we, and I added this after Claire's talk, that always remains in the future because the liberal scholarly gaze is filtered through a staunchly post- or decolonial optic of the unacceptability of a human we commandeered by an exclusionary, imperialist, democratic, white male Eurocentric elite. The practical we has yet to match the aspirational we because there was a disjuncture from the outset between exclusionary application and inclusionary meaning. Quijano's understanding of equality as fundamentally white and exclusionary helps us to understand centuries' worth of racialized behavior of discrimination in the name of equality. The understanding of the discursive concept of equality as white also helps us to understand why the assumption of its universality across all lines of discrimination, but especially of race, terminally dead-end in frustration. If equality is white, limited to the top of a racial, economic, geographical, discursive hierarchy, then it was always already partial and never capable of the universality of veneer with which it has been continually invested. If it is coloniality that births both racial hierarchy and the commerce that will generate enough wealth to underwrite the economic and political independence necessary to break with colonial empire and underwrite non-imperial governing structures like democracy, which we would see as no more nor less than an expansion of white male privilege beyond those imperial structures, then I would also underscore my own view that the inherently partial notion of equality that it engendered was rooted in the discursive model of emotion-based horizontal universality. That is, a logic of a right to well-being and positive affect is part of white male European Eurocentric privilege. Well-being and the pursuit of happiness are reserved for white wealth, is what Quijano's model suggests, if I extend it to the terrain of affect, with non-whites relegated to its opposite, which elsewhere I've called ill-being, suffering, disease, death. But just as within the model of partial equality, we see its universal promise, its aspirational promise, we likewise also see in the partially authorized pursuit of happiness the eventual promise of absolute inclusion and emotional plenitude for all. Can an economic model predicated on the exploitative devastation and negative emotional experience, including family separation, violence, overworking, and death, that paradoxically gave rise to the concept of universal freedom and happiness, shed its exploitative structure to keep its horizontal effective promise? Or will that system continue to perfect its capture of discursive and effective exclusion, perpetuating the hierarchically racialized coloniality of power in which universal well-being is really only still reserved for a still overwhelmingly white male-dominant class? I would argue that our effective rights are being actively and aggressively arbitrated in the cultural mainstream. The status quo continues to claim well-being and to demand identificatory empathy for whiteness, especially male. It is thus, I would argue, that we can understand Kate Mann's analysis of himpathy, the excessive sympathy that U.S. culture extends to its male perpetrators of sexual violence, as what propelled Brett Kavanaugh to the highest court in the land. Thus, that we may understand how the assessment of, quote, having had a bad day, end quote, could possibly have been uttered by a law enforcement official as an empathic point of entry into the psyche of the white male murderer of predominantly Asian and predominantly female spa workers in Georgia. Thus, may we understand centuries of effective dehumanization of the non-white other in the US and in the Western world. Thus, may we understand all the current talk about not making kids, quote unquote, feel bad about being white, end quote, in anti-critical race theory discourse, a sentiment intoned all the way from rural PTA members to former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Thus, may we understand the cultural injunction in the US against empathizing with Palestine versus the contrasting requirement to empathize with Ukraine. On the other hand, in the same way that there is a push to perfect political equality, I would argue that there is a push to perfect effective equality, opening access to well-being across lines of race and gender. I would go further to argue that this push in the affective dimension is the constitutive push toward political equality itself, in the epistemological language of affect that I argue is culturally ascendant. Thus, may we understand the Dalai Lama's mission of finding joy in troubled times, the trope of quote-unquote black girl magic, which combines an opposition to reason and implicitly positive affect with public and professional success. Or its counterpart, quote-unquote black boy joy, which is the title of, I think, 17 essays or stories about black male childhood in the US. And Cornel West's insistence on black love in a political dimension, offering a masterclass that, quote, explains the significance of black love in all its forms, art, culture, family, community, and dignity, and why, despite trauma, Black Americans continue to create freedom fighters to spread black joy and win liberty for all, end quote. This is my final section. I would like to end on the lighter note of activating libidinal mirror neurons. The lighter note is Shonda Rhimes' eminently bingeable Bridgerton, a Regency-era Netflix series about ahistorically interracial romantic matchmaking. These couples are most definitely not bucking the system. They are not robbing banks or blowing up government buildings. They are instead having sex in ornate gazebos, reaching for one another with desirous pinky fingers outstretched beneath their luxurious silks, falling on top of one another in the mucky fringe of a cricket game. In the second season of Bridgerton, the competing love interests of the white Viscount are both Indian, which relieves the plot of all political pressure. Either way the marriage story concludes, there will be both relief and remediation in the union of empire and colony as equals, though this is not developed, and a guaranteed impact of miscegenation upon British peerage. This liberates the audience to enjoy what could reasonably be considered soft porn, thinly veiled with the age-old cloak of a passionate quest for true love. This activation of racialized mirror neurons at a libidinal level is not as trivial as it might seem. I think of Loving versus Virginia, for example, that is not that long ago. Even the most cursory consultation of Twitter feeds reveals vicarious public lusting by users of all apparent races and ethnicities, and genders, I think, for both members of the couple, and approval of their relationship. That Bridgerton could achieve this level of both abstraction and acceptance of interracial sexual desire with an apparently equally near-perfect suspension of disbelief about its historical inaccuracies, past or present, is truly remarkable. It is not the kind of activism that I would have rationally predicted could outpace the impact of so many erudite Hannah Joneses, Coateses, Quijanos, even bookworm Leguizamos. Though the show firmly entraps us in hierarchies of gender and class in order to liberate us from the strictures of race, perhaps in this hyper-stylization, it is nevertheless one counterintuitively liberating wave of passion that we should allow to sweep us along with it. Not towards some sort of neo-fascist cosmic race mestizaje, but toward a democratization of empathy at the most visceral level of desire for companionship, where love is defined as equality, working against death and toward well-being. I want to be clear that by my own logic of capitalism's epistemological capture of affect, this would be a case of the master's tools bringing down the master's house. And if so, perhaps that is because it could also be called a case of grabbing the capitalist master by the proverbial balls. Thank you very much.